Let me start this video off with a question. How many hours did you work this week? How many days did you show up on time, do what you were told, and follow all the rules you were supposed to? And yet, rent is due, you still have to go grocery shopping, and you don't have anything in savings. On top of that, your mental health is in turmoil because of it. Oh, but don't worry, your boss just saved up for his second yacht. Or maybe you just got laid off because the shareholders weren't making enough money. Welcome to capitalism, the system that promises freedom, equality, and prosperity. But this capitalism doesn't work in practice. Even in theory, there are inherent flaws that are impossible to get rid of. These contradictions of capitalism make it impossible for the system to work as expected and doom the system to its inevitable end. In the theoretical framework, there are inherent flaws introduced that are impossible to get rid of without a complete overhaul of the system. These flaws are so severe that it spells certain doom for the capitalist framework. From the very beginning, the system was set up to fail. Much as feudalism and its weak points led to capitalism, capitalism will inevitably lead us to another economic system, and to another evolution of society altogether. But before we get much deeper into this, let's start with the very basics. What is a contradiction? A contradiction arises when there's an opposition between two statements. Aristotle, who is credited with establishing formal logic in philosophy, defines this principal fact about contradictions. Quote, "For the same thing to hold good and to not hold good simultaneously of the same thing and in the same respect is impossible." A contradiction boils down to this: two claims that cannot be reconciled with one another. Think about the opening sentence of A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Or the famous line from George Orwell's Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. These statements are contradictory. They both cannot be simultaneously true. It's clear to us that all animals cannot both be equal, but some animals get better treatment than others. Contradictory statements are nonsensical. They're boldly untrue, and they cannot continue to exist as they are, indefinitely, without being analyzed, corrected, or clarified. There's an inherent tension that exists in them, and that's kind of the point of using them in literature. But how about in philosophy? Most of Marx's writing is directly inspired by Hegel, a philosopher who was one of the most influential writers in all of Germany at the time Marx was writing. We aren't going to talk much on Hegel, mostly because I haven't done much reading of his work. However, to properly understand Marx, we must understand Hegel's dialectic. The Hegelian dialectic is an ever-evolving process of contradictory sides. It's a process of advancement, wherein the advancement must come into being through the said contradiction taking place. Think about the philosophy of Plato. All of his works are written as conversations. One person declares a statement and the other posits their ideas on the topic. Both of their ideas are in opposition at this point. However, with further communication and argument, a new idea is created from the conversation, one that is more sophisticated than the simple ideas they begin with. Now, Hegel didn't actually believe Plato's dialogues to get anywhere philosophically, but I think it's a great illustration on how his dialectic works in philosophy. Let's think of it in another way. If you know anything about Marx or Hegel, you might have heard the formula of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Hegel scholars don't like this approach to his dialectic since it misses out on a lot of nuance of the dialectic, but I think for our purposes, it's going to suffice to illustrate the point. Let's try this out with an example. How about your views on a certain topic? Climate change, for example. The thesis is your current belief in the topic. Let's say you think the climate is changing because of natural systems. But then, you read a rigorous study that holds a different belief than yours, one that provides evidence for climate change occurring because of human activity, leading to instability. This is the antithesis, something that is challenging to the current thesis. Then, once both your thesis and antithesis are shown to be contradictory, you change your views on climate change. Maybe now you notice how weather patterns have changed in your area and are more curious as to why. This is the synthesis, the amalgamation of both views into a more comprehensive idea. I know both of the examples I've used are two ideological examples, but the dialectic doesn't just apply to ideas. It applies to systems, to social structures, even to history. That's how capitalism became feudalism, because of this dialectic. Internal contradictions of a system, ideology, structure, anything, become so obvious and strong that a change must be made. And this is why Marx is so important. He used Hegel's dialectic to analyze the structures of capitalism, liberalism, and the society in which he lived that resulted because of these systems. Hegel's project was dedicated to philosophy and history more broadly abstract ideas. Marx flipped this idea into his own, instead focusing on the material realities of the world. Using Hegel's dialectic, Marx created the theory of history called historical materialism. This is the theory Marx used to describe how and why history unfolds as it has. He explains history as a scientifically understandable process, where one point in time leads to the next through the development of society, technology, and politics. There have been, and still are, several other ways in which to view history, none of which, except for Hegel's, I find to be as interesting and as convincing as Marx's. History isn't a straight line where time just keeps moving forward, nor is its course guided by a few great men. As Lenin describes it, history, quote, spirals not in a straight line, a development by leaps, catastrophes, and revolutions, breaks in continuity, the transformation of quantity into quality, inner impulses towards development imparted by the contradiction and conflict of the various forces and tendencies. People are surrounded by the circumstances in which they live. Like fish in water, they don't even notice it. If you had been born 500 years ago, you wouldn't have even thought of things like the internet, mass media, or electricity. And this would have completely changed not only your life, but the very way you think of life and perceive everything. This is paramount to Marx's theory. The material realities in which you live impact you. It's not the other way around. The material realities, meaning the physical and technological time in which you occupy, control the way you see everything. This is why things must develop in a certain way according to Marx. Feudalism must precede capitalism, and capitalism to socialism. This topic is so interesting and diverse that I'll be dedicating another video to it. I just wanted to illustrate the way in which Marx views history and the world. So now that we have a little background on the ideas of contradictions, Hegel's views of them, and further, Marx's analysis on the world, let's talk about some of the contradictions in capitalism. In Hegel's triadic, the contradictions of capitalism would be an antithesis, things that are inherent inside of the thesis and will continue to become more and more obvious until a change occurs towards a new synthesis. The problems of capitalism are so numerous and severe that they are problems that they must be contended with. Even in a non-Marxist pro-neoliberal tradition, these problems are still discussed. Financial risk is a huge part of our economy, and it is a glaring example of the problems we face with a society that continues to be based on capitalism. The contradictions of capital become more and more glaring as time moves on. Some of them so much so to the point that they're completely obvious. So let's count the ways in which capitalism will end in its own destruction. Let's start with the most obvious and most impactful contradiction, the relationship between the workers and the capitalists. The capitalists own the means of production, otherwise known as the tools you need to do your job. They monopolize these means of production, but they need someone with the knowledge on how to use them to work and produce goods. This is the entire basis for capitalism. The owner wants to pay this worker the least amount of money possible, while the worker wants to earn the most possible. Because this dichotomy exists, there's an inherent contradiction between capitalist and worker. The only interest of the capitalist is to continue to make more money. The interest of the worker is to gain as much money as possible from the work he performs. Since, after all, this is how the capitalist makes money, through the monopolization of the means of production, the power is in the capitalist's hand to allow the worker to use this equipment. Think about a car factory. How much equipment, robotics, parts exist in one of these places? Certainly there's no way on earth that a worker would be able to get enough equipment to start his own car factory. This means the imbalance of power between the laborers and capitalists is uneven. One has to sell their labor to survive, while the other can coast on the work that the worker does. In this car factory, every person is assigned one task: tighten a bolt, put on a side mirror, etc. This mindless, boring work alienates the worker from their labor, meaning the worker sees themselves as a cog in a machine, rather than a person who is fulfilled by a job that they can see, like a cottage goods seller. This makes people become separated from their work. They don't see their labor as a part of them. Instead, the goal of capitalism is to make the things you buy the real you. The labor you give is just the price to pay for self-expression. The alienation of capitalism is another contradiction. People want to be fulfilled through their work. However, capitalism won't allow that to happen, if at all possible. Of course, there are going to be people who are fulfilled by their job, but that's not the norm. Under capitalism, the goal of a corporation is to extract the most money possible. This leads to companies pricing items, not by the value of the labor that was put into a good, but rather by the value that someone is willing to pay for the item. To a Marxist economist, this may be the most important and powerful contradiction. Let's think about a couple of edge cases in this equation: public transit and pharmaceuticals. Public transit has a high use value, but a low exchange value, meaning people aren't willing to pay much for it, but it helps people tremendously. Because of the discrepancy between the two, public transit isn't treated with the respect it deserves, nor is it produced in sufficient enough quantities for it to be useful for everyone. Public transit, at least in America, is known for being underfunded, overcrowded, dirty, and underutilized. Under capitalism, a service only gets our money if it generates a return on investment. It doesn't matter the use to society that it brings. Even though public transit is vital to the working class, it is continuously undervalued and left underfunded because there isn't a way to extract enough surplus value out of it for the capitalists to care. With a high labor cost and a low exchange value, public transit isn't seen as worth an investment. Now let's think about the opposite of this: pharmaceuticals. How about a prescription for a life-saving drug, something as simple as insulin? Insulin has a huge use value to some because it's life-saving. Because of that, the few companies that produce it know they can charge whatever they want to, and nobody will stop them, since there's no way to break into a market that is so highly monopolized. These drugs don't take much labor input, yet they're sold for large sums of money because these companies know that there's really no other option. Capitalism doesn't allocate resources based on need or the contribution of labor in the products. Instead, it allocates them based on who's willing and able to pay the most money. This is the important thing. It's a complete misalignment of labor and resources that everyone agrees is wrong. In America, the majority of citizens support both universal healthcare and further investment into public transport. But because people at the top might make $98 billion instead of $100 billion, it's a no-go. But how about another contradiction in capitalism, one between sustainability and growth? Growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. The most important contradiction, in fact the one that kickstarted the idea of this entire video, is the contradiction between the infinite growth of capitalism and the impossibility of infinite growth. When stated out loud, it seems completely obvious. The capitalist system absolutely cannot keep growing forever. It's going to get to a point where there are no more resources to take over, there's no more things to sell, and no more things to make. But nobody thinks it's going to be in any near future, and if it's something that's going to happen way after they're dead, then what do they care? Short-term growth is necessary for the continuance of capitalism, but there aren't infinite resources on the Earth, or even the universe for that matter. This contradiction is very straightforward. Capitalism needs infinite growth and a finite amount of resources. This is why environmental regulations are being dismantled more and more each passing day, or why federal land is going to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. Capitalists need more and more resources to make money. The environmental impact isn't taken into account. The impact on people's health, physically or mentally, the negative effect they have on the entire world doesn't matter, as long as it brings in money. Capitalism will cut off its nose to spite its face if it means giving the shareholders value. The growth structure is necessary under capitalism. The profit motive is the only thing that keeps the system going. Think about a massive company like Amazon. They began just selling books, then they expanded to selling everything. Their own distribution processes across the world, and they'll even ship you pharmaceuticals. And they're just going to continue to grow, because that's what the shareholders need. That's how capitalism is ran. Because if Amazon didn't hit their quarterly earnings goals, the stock price would fall. Everyone is at the mercy of the markets, and that line better continue to go up. But you know what the market doesn't care about? Pollution, biodiversity, or the climate. These aren't priced in, because finance doesn't care about the future. The only thing investment firms are worried about is the next fiscal quarter. Think about how the usage of energy and fresh water have skyrocketed with the AI boom. Every single company is trying to integrate it into their product. Now, companies are lobbying to open nuclear facilities to power their energy-hungry AI systems. Don't get me wrong, I'm not against nuclear energy. But isn't it pretty dystopian that private companies are lobbying the government to open their own nuclear facilities just so they can power these huge wastes of energy, all for profit to increase? This isn't even to talk about the impact of fossil fuels on the environment, we're just talking about nuclear here. The effect that fossil fuels have done to our environment still isn't over, it's nowhere near. With the ineffectiveness of any sort of international agreements, we're in store for some seriously destructive climate change. And conservatives on Facebook will continue to believe that it's the government seeding the clouds. Do you see how all of this will eventually be need to addressed, one way or another? The contradiction between the infinite growth cycle and the inability for things to grow infinitely is one that will have to be answered sooner or later. Whether it be after millions of deaths that have occurred due to rising sea levels, heat waves, and ever-increasing unstable weather, or before that happens. Now that we have this great image of the future in our heads, let's set our eyes on one more contradiction, one between the free market and monopolization. The hallmark of capitalism is, in fact, its free markets. A system where anyone can do business together, unrestricted, unhindered by regulation, and completely on merit. But when you dive into the theory a little more, it's clear that the inevitable outcome of capitalism is monopolies. After all, in the free market, only the strongest survive. Small businesses are destined to fail under their huge competitors. Walmart pushes other retail stores out of local areas, big pharmaceutical companies have made it impossible for new ones to start, and big tech buys up competitors and shuts down their products so they have less competition. This is exactly what capitalism is all about. Remember that infinite growth we were just talking about? This is exactly what it leads to. Infinite growth into just a few small corporations. Wealth accumulation into the hands of fewer and fewer is the entire point of the system. The rich get richer while the poor get poorer. This contradiction of capitalism is seemingly getting more and more obvious. As power continues to go into fewer and fewer people's hands, there are cries of an oligarchy. The tech giants are now seen as who they've been this whole time, resource-hungry villains that continue to exploit everything for their own gain. And these monopolies don't just happen because the largest firms have the best products, or provide the best value for money to consumers. It's simply because they have a larger market share, or the government maybe gives them special treatment. There's no merit in these things. Jeff Bezos has just as many hours in a week as I do, and I can't imagine he's working during as many of them as I am. In 1917, Lenin argued that capitalism had evolved into a new form, Imperialism. The hallmarks of this evolution are the concentration of capital leading to monopolies, the appearance of finance capital, the creation of international monopolies, and the division of the world amongst the major capitalist countries. Lenin sees this as a necessary structure of the late-stage capitalist system we live in, because again, the domestic markets have been drained for their resources and capitalism can never stop expanding. As Lenin puts it, quote, concentration of production, the monopolies arising from this concentration, the merging of bank capital with industrial capital, this is the principal and typical feature of capitalism at its latest stage. With all of this talk about the contradictions of capitalism, I hope it's made you think at least a little deeper about the inevitable problems that our current systems face. I certainly don't expect you to become a card-carrying Marxist after these questions have been posed to you, But the reality is, these are things that must be solved. Capitalism is a system by which, in its very core, has created its own inevitable downfall. However, I don't agree with Marx that the inevitable solution is a communist utopia. I don't even necessarily think that a left-wing government is going to be in any way timely. As the world swings more and more to the right, it seems easier to give up hope now than ever. Yet, it's important to continue to challenge the status quo that keeps us overworked, underpaid, and keeps us working to line the pockets of people that already have more money than we will ever see in our lives. We aren't living in a merit-based world. Class mobility is declining. Now you're just lucky to make as much money as your parents. Good luck trying to make more. As capitalism continues to enshrine everything, look out for those around you and keep your head above water in any way you can. And keep organizing. One day something may actually happen. And remember, quote, "The last capitalist we hang shall be the one who sold us the rope."